Hello, everybody. It is 10 o'clock on Saturday night. I am Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical. I have with me Chris Carlson. Hello, Chris. How are you?
Recovering from the drive.
Chris did a lot of driving. So Chris lives in Minnesota. He was not in Minnesota, 2 days ago?
Yeah. We did the long route to the East Coast. My wife had an event, and I went to Archives 2 for a couple of days.
So Archives 2 is part of the National Archives. It's a big building in Maryland, basically in the suburbs of DC. I actually used to live fairly close to Archives 2 right after it had been built, but I've never actually been in it. So
it's a lovely facility. It's really well laid out. They have a lot of people there to help you, which is nice because their online assistance is really pretty bad.
Well, at least they got the in-person stuff right.
Oh yeah, and so I got about 12 folders worth of photos that I have to now go through and put together.
This is good, everybody, because this is all potentially stuff that's going to show up, potentially on this show, but certainly in things like Harpoon and other presentations that Chris does.
Actually, a lot of this stuff we're attempting. There's a German scholar. He's actually a geologist by education, but by hobby, he's big into naval technology, and he understands the German archives very well. And he would like to get Eberhard Roessler's books on German sonars for submarines and German submarine torpedoes translated into English. The only Roessler book we have is his History of U-Boats, and that came out of Castle Books. It's in second edition. Unfortunately, Dr. Roessler he's very old, and he has those mental issues of being very old.
Yeah.
So they're trying to get his estate to approve the translation, and then this particular academic who's putting together wants to show where German technology in those areas went. And so I'm helping him with US, French, and Russian sonar systems and torpedoes.
Okay, well, that sounds cool. I look forward to seeing that stuff. I look forward to seeing everything that Chris does, which means I also look forward to seeing what he's going to do for us tonight, because everybody who was here last week, or not last week, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, may recall that Chris, there was a miscommunication between, honestly, it was between one half of your brain and the other half of your brain, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and I didn't get the reminder in my email.
Yeah, but I feel bad because I didn't do what I normally did, because I said, "Oh, Chris is the most reliable guy on the planet. I don't have to worry about this. I don't have to." It's like, okay, all right, I just need to do that because Chris is the most reliable guy on the planet. But even the most reliable guy on the planet, when his wife says, "Hey, let's go hang out with my mother and take her to dinner and stuff," is likely to say yes, dear, unless he's got something specifically like
yes.
right in front of him. So,
and I didn't, unfortunately.
Well, for what it's worth, I was able to do the show perfectly fine. Lisa and I did the show by ourselves, and you got to go spend time with your mother-in-law and get her out of her facility for a little while. So I think it was a win-win for everybody. But I'm definitely glad you're here tonight. We can talk some about LCS and stuff like that. So one other little thing before we move on. About 45 minutes ago or so, maybe a little bit longer ago than that, I was on the phone with Pat Doyle, he of the high-speed aluminum tubing business, He is currently in a hotel in New York, I think, maybe something like that. Yeah, he's somewhere in the East Coast because he said, "Shouldn't you be doing a show right now?" And it's like, no, it's 10 o'clock Eastern time, not 9 o'clock Eastern time. And he went, "Oh, okay," because it was like 9:15 Eastern when he said that. But he wanted to be on the show, but unfortunately, his wake up call is like 6:30, which means for crew rest purposes, he was heading off to bed because he has a moral and a legal obligation to get 8 hours of sleep a night. You've heard that.
I always thought it was convenient for aviators.
Well, you've heard what naval aviators say about the NATOPS manual and crew rest.
Mm-hmm.
It says you have to get 8 hours of sleep a day. Everything you get at night is extra.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Okay. So let's go ahead. Let me pull slides up. Oh, wait a minute. What's going on? Oh, I think I know what's going on. Do I need to do that? No, that's not the one. That's the one. Okay. Oh, and I forgot that these are the right slides with the wrong
title.
I'm sure it's the right slides with the. Let me double check that it's the right slides. Yeah, I can't do it without actually going through it.
I thought we were supposed to be 149 today.
We are.
Okay.
This is the right. I think I just forgot to change the front. Because this is the right announcements page. Okay, so you'll note some changes. There are some maybes in there, like there's a maybe for next week and a maybe for the week after. Originally, those were going to be no's. And the reason why they were going to be no's is I was supposed to go out of town. And I was going to be like totally and completely, like I was supposed to, the 26th of October was going to be a work day. Because I was going to be doing a game. But as it turns out, none of that is happening. I am not doing that trip. I'm getting to do some medical testing and stuff instead. Nothing terribly serious, but stuff that's in the sort of deal with now category. So I am not doing that trip. And so the rest of the schedule you can sort of see there. There's some maybes in there. There's some, I can't tell towards the end of the year, et cetera, et cetera. The next session or two is probably going to be carriers of large objects, which is some proposals that came out from Mike Bosworth, who at the time was a lieutenant commander, limited engineering duty officer, not limited duty officer, engineering duty officer, who then retired from the Navy and went to work at NAVSEA as a naval architect. But during his time in uniform, while he was in NAVSEA, he did some very interesting stuff on modular ship construction and different things you could carry in ships. So like one type of carrier of large objects is an aircraft carrier, another type is an amphib, but he proposed some new objects that you could put in there. And so I need to been wanting to reread that stuff. I read it about once every 18 months anyway. And so I'll do some stuff on that because it seems to sort of fit in with the general topics we've been doing lately. And then I'm going to talk about traveler navies, I think. And so that's what's going to happen in the near future. As always, whenever we do stuff like that, we're trying to, any images we're using, et cetera, we're presenting for educational purposes and to sort of critique the ideas involved in them. So that's how we do things around here. Okay, so next slide is Chris, over to you.
Okay, you want me to share my screen, or are we working off yours?
We're going to work off mine, I think.
Okay, alrighty. How this started is Mr. Weuve and I were lamenting on the lack of combat capability of the LCS designs. Minimum self-defense, in a lot of ways, pretty minimum anti-submarine, pretty minimum anti-mine. And recently, they may get up to fleet average with anti-surface if they can put 8 of the naval strike missiles on them.
Yeah.
But while we were talking about that, we got sidetracked, as often is the case.
Really?
Because Chris always wants to try and relate reality with science fiction, and it's an interesting.
My fandom superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time.
So while we were talking about one of our favorite navies, which is the Honor Harrington universe, I mentioned that, I've been looking at the LCS, and when I look at the back end, I think, could I make this a pod knot? Now, a pod knot in the Honor Harrington universe is a honkin' big ship, and it kicks out missile pallets, missile containers, missile pods out the back end. And I show you some lovely drawings, courtesy of several people in BuNine that Chris and I know.
Mm-hmm.
And you could launch huge salvos. At one point in time, that was one of my biggest gripes about the Honor Harrington universe is when you see missile salvos in the tens of thousands, it gets a little weird.
You know what what the unit of measurement for that is, right?
No.
Those are referred to as they're
Webbers.
Webbers of missiles. He fired a Weber of missiles at them. So let me dial back just a little bit on this because two thoughts that I think that is actually probably worth foot stomping just a little bit. One is that we've spent a lot of time talking about LCS, and we spent a bunch of time talking about how the LCS program. Bob Work did a lot of thinking about the LCS program and what it could be. And there was sort of a reasonably firm theoretical basis. It wasn't concrete, but it was at least hard packed dirt as a theoretical basis for what Navy was trying to do. And Work said, let's give it a shot. But what we ended up getting wasn't quite what was promised. For a lot of reasons, and let's just leave aside all the programmatic stuff there about admirals not in the words of Will O'Neill, the admirals not understanding that you can't make the inside bigger than the outside. When push came to shove, these things were going to be modular, and they were going to load these warfare modules on board, and the warfare modules didn't happen by and large. Some of them were just like they couldn't make the engineering work, and some of them it turned out to be too expensive. For a whole variety of reasons, they just didn't make it work. And so they aimed for the stars, and they always say if you shoot for the moon, you'll land amongst the stars. In this case, I don't think they quite got to escape velocity, and so they burned up someplace over the Pacific. So that's the first thing, is that this was us talking about, well, what would we use these for? And one of the things I thought of is like, we need flight decks, right? We need hangars. Well, I actually went and pulled the numbers on it. I don't think we need hangars that much, because the Arleigh Burke class has replaced all the hangars that we lost. The late model Burkes have replaced all the hangars we lost when the Sprucans left the fleet, and they're going to when the Tychos, which are about to leave the fleet, just back of the envelope calculation, I think we're fine on hangars. But Chris actually had this idea to do this. Now, this is an Honor Harrington pod knot. Anybody who's read the series, and if you haven't read the series, my God, why haven't you read the series? In the series, we see over the course of about I think it's 10 years or so in the series, there is a huge change in naval architecture in the series. At the beginning, you have dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts that have missile launchers. They have some missile capability, and they also have some energy weapon capability. But the Royal Manticore Navy really develops the ability to shoot weapons at a much longer range. And this has, and with the fire, they developed the technology for longer range missiles, and they also developed the technology for the fire control to go along with it. And these things together are really a revolution in military affairs for how naval battles are fought and how naval ships are constructed. And so the podnot is the natural evolution of this. Missiles come to totally and completely dominate. They had generally been the long range solution, but they became just incredibly more the long range solution. And the solution is a ship that the ship that you see on the screen there is largely hollow through the core of the ship.
You can point out where those the middle two rows end of those weapons ports. Everything after those endpoints is the hollow missile core.
Yeah, so basically that circle that you see there, that's a tube that extends about 40% of the way to the. It's not quite the halfway.
It's not so much tubes; it's a set of rails.
Right. I mean, there's a big hollow in the middle.
Yeah. There's a big hollow tube. There is some armor on the sides. Because it's not quite the core hull, but they do provide some protection for it.
Yeah.
The other thing, the thing that you're missing though, when you talk about podnots, is not just the missile range, and it's not just the fire control, which was their last step. The big issue with the podnot was fire density. They could fire more missiles than anybody could handle in their defensive arrangements, because before a super dreadnought had something like 32, 36 missile tubes. Well, if you just take a look at this diagram here, I've got 6 pods with 10 missiles each, and I can launch 6 pods every 12 seconds. So you have a phenomenal missile density. And that's really those 3 things: the extended range, the better the fire control, and the missile salvo density just completely overwhelms the defenses of the enemy.
And this includes some nifty tricks like one missile in each pod is actually just a faster than light relay back to the main ship. So now that you've got the main ship's computer not only coordinating fire, so you don't have, that's one of the things about like Harpoon, the comment has been made about the US Navy's Harpoon missile, cutting edge 1980s technology. When the Harpoon goes into the mailbox, the address is "to whom it may concern."
Yep.
And so CNA, the organization I used to work for, ruined the Navy's day one day when they published the study. They sent them the study that concluded that the Navy hadn't thought through how to target this thing. If you fire 6 missiles at 6 ships that are in a formation, one ship is going to have a really bad day and the other 5 ships will sail away. And that's because if you fire all the missiles down the same bearing with the same settings, they're all going to pick the same target. And so that faster than light missile, faster than light relay that would fly with the other missiles in the pod allows the ship to first of all deconflict stuff and send it where they need to send it to penetrate defenses. And it also allows them to use the ship's computer to deal with the enemy ECM. And so instead of having a computer that you can fit in that will fit in a relatively small missile, and by relatively small, I mean something the size of like a US Navy submarine launched ballistic missile. Instead, you can have it, the entire ship's computer can solve that problem for you. And then you've also got your own ECM dazzlers and stuff like that is now all being coordinated from the central ship's computer. And so rather than each missile being just this thing that you throw out and it's sort of on its own and it's doing its own thing, now you fire 5,000 missiles. Those 5,000 missiles are working together in a way that they weren't before. And that changes the universe. And for what it's worth, some of this stuff we're seeing today, more and more countries are coming out with missiles that when multiple missiles are in flight together, they talk to each other and they figure out who's taken what target, et cetera, and they do some coordination.
The thing that I found funny is when I finally got a chance to read some of the Russian history, the original SSN-12 did exactly that. It had the scout mode. The like the shipwreck, the 19. So one would fly high, scout everything out, and then assign targets to the others.
Yeah. And that stuff, I mean, one of the recurring themes when it comes to data links is I always tell people that cooperative engagement capability and NIFCA, Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter Air, which are these nifty new tools that the Navy's developed over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years for CEC, make data links work like you always thought they did. Mm-hmm. They make data links work like they work in David Weber's Starfire universe. And by that, I mean, they allow you to target off of somebody else's solution. Data links until fairly recently were just a way to tell you where to point your radar. So you couldn't just fire on somebody else's track. You still had to put your radar on it, because track quality data is not the same as targeting quality data. And the analogy that I use for that is if you're using binoculars and you've got a spotter that's telling you where to look, he's not telling you where to point the binoculars like this. He's saying, like, he's telling you where, he's not giving you like up and to the left, et cetera, et cetera. He's telling you, see the tree over there, look about a third of the way up the tree off on the right-hand side. And then you put the binoculars up and you look at that, right? So you sort of do the big picture scan. Somebody's telling you where to look, but you use your own binoculars. This is the equivalent of, with modern technology, it's the equivalent of, I've got a rifle that's pointing in a direction and Chris is telling me where to move it to get a shot. And as you might imagine, there's a word to describe that, and that word is hard. In fact, there's an adjective to describe it, but let's keep this PG.
Bloody hard.
Yeah, really hard, really hard. Yeah, that's exactly the word I was thinking of. So this is one of the reasons why I like having conversations like this, is because I see, I can talk about science fiction navies and real world navies at the same time and sort of relate back and forth to them. So that's what we're seeing here.
So what happens while we're talking about pod knots? I said, the Navy has a self-encased missile launcher, but it's only on submarines. So why don't you go to the next slide? And that's this. It's the encapsulated harpoon. It fits in a torpedo tube. It's in a buoyant canister, and you can kick it out, and the submarine can launch a harpoon. On the nose are two pressure sensors, and as they break the surface, it says, "Oh, atmospheric pressure," blows the cap off and launches the missile. But this is completely waterproof, obviously, and somewhat robust because we kick it out with a water slug.
And this capsule is a fantastic idea because it means that you don't have to design your missile to be able to deal with all that stuff, which is extra mass, and as a result, it decreases your range and makes you slower and stuff like that. You build a capsule and then you leave the capsule behind. And so you don't have, your missile doesn't pay the performance penalty for this really, really nifty trick you have of firing it out of a submarine.
And this is different than the way the French and the Russians do it. The SM-39 Exocet, the canister launches into the air, and then the missile is ejected from the canister as it's airborne, as does the Russian 3M54 Club, or the SSN-27. It also goes airborne, and then the missile comes out of the canister. So this is a little different. The Chinese, when they first made their submarine launch weapon from a submerged submarine, the YG-82, they basically copied this encapsulated harpoon concept and just put a YJ-8 missile in it. Okay, next.
Well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Okay, this just gives you the overall configuration, your length, your width. Note that buoyancy is actually, it's pretty buoyant. 570 pounds is a good buoyancy on that puppy. It'll get it up, and then the little control fins on the back will then pitch it up. So that also helps drive it up from the impulse from the torpedo tubes. Overall, the weight's just over a metric ton. So it's not really all that heavy. And its length, all the neat parameters there that y'all need. So here's the trick. The Navy's got something that has an anti-ship cruise missile that can go in the water and get wet. How do I get it into the water? That's
okay.
The big question.
So are these things? Is this a new variation of this? Because at one point, the Navy pulled all the submarine-launched harpoons out of the fleet and remanufactured them into air-launched harpoons.
Yes, and that was because we couldn't target them from a submarine. We didn't have Link 16 yet. Basically, it got down to a submarine would have to shoot on bearing-only launch because we could never get a targeting solution good enough to shoot a harpoon. I mean, beyond about 25,000, a little over 12 and a half miles, you really can't generate a firing solution with passive acoustics. You don't get bearing rate. So you just get this, he's over there.
And, we had this problem with Tomahawk anti-ship missile, even more so.
Yes.
Because TASM had like a 450 nautical mile range, and it was relatively slow. I mean, it's high subsonic. So for a subsonic,
it was 250. TASM was 250. Yeah. Because the radar is heavy, and it had a bullpup warhead that's armored. That's heavy.
Okay. All right. My sources may be wrong on that. I remember 450 from when I was working on it, but I could be misremembering. The upshot though is that it's relatively slow.
And it's long range.
Yeah, and so that means it's got a long flight time, and so ships aren't very fast, but they are fast enough that if you dump a missile, you have a missile come in. And the thing is it's not like the missile can detect everything in all directions. The missile's got a radar that has a field of view, right? And so if you're not pointed at the target, you're not going to see it. And so that's one of the reasons, that's the reason they brought it out of the fleet, is that you can't place it in a way where you can point your sensor and get the right field of view and detect the target. It might be that it's right there, right? You might be right on top of it, but you're just looking in the wrong direction when you open the seeker hood.
Well, actually, the Tomahawk had seeker boxes. It would perform a search over an area.
Oh, it would?
Yes, but here's the problem.
Where were you 20 years ago when I needed all this information?
I'm sorry. The thing is that if you thought harpoons were addressed to whom it may concern, so is the Tomahawk.
Yeah.
And the U.S. Navy figured out that white shipping is a real pain in the butt.
Yeah. White shipping is all the stuff you're trying not to hit.
Preferably, yes.
Like that fishing trawler and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it just goes, ooh, look.
Yeah.
We've tried to do some interesting ideas to it, like giving Tomahawk the ability to identify a radar or two that were on known combatants and then try to home in on that. That didn't help out quite so much, again, because the bearing resolution wasn't very great. So here's the thing. We thought it would be easier to target than it turned out to be. And
yeah.
that really affected both the Tomahawk anti-ship missile and the harpoon. Now with Link 16, submarines can now target harpoon.
I'm going to try something real quick.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. The problem. What was I going to say about this? So this is actually, this illustrates one of the sort of fundamental issues that you run into when you're developing new weapon systems. And that is, you can't do all the pieces sequentially. You have to sort of do the initial study and say, do we think we can solve this problem? Do we think we can solve this problem? Do we think we can solve this problem? And then you work on solving all those problems, right? And you're inevitably going to run into problems where things turned out to be harder than you thought they were going to be. And you're also going to run into problems where like some stuff just fails, right? So Harpoon is a great example of this, or Tomahawk anti-ship is a better example of this, right? Because Harpoon was deployed. We just learned there was some, but Tomahawk anti-ship we actually pulled out of the fleet because we discovered that on the Tomahawk side of things, it was harder than we thought it was going to be. But we also made this assumption that we were going to be able to solve this targeting problem, stuff that wasn't the missile itself, but would tell people where to shoot the missile. We thought we were going to solve this targeting problem. And we had all sorts of nifty ideas on how we were going to do that. And maybe we'll send stuff from off board the ship, and maybe we'll do this, and maybe we'll do that. And in the end, it didn't work. And I'm reminded of what one of my colleagues at CNA said when I was talking with him about Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles. His comment was, we couldn't solve the targeting problem, and the Russians couldn't solve the targeting problem. If the Chinese can solve it, they deserve to win. Now, the problem with that is, I mean, I don't want to go into a sidebar on that, but the problem is that the anti-ship ballistic missile targeting problem is actually a substantially different problem than the TASM targeting problem.
Yeah.
For a whole bunch of reasons involving the speed of the platform and the angle that you get the look at.
Now, in criticism of your former colleague, the Russians did figure out the TASM, the anti-ship missile. And I've written a couple articles on their over-horizon targeting complexes, which they introduced in 1974, and we were oblivious for about 20 years that they had done it. Now, the ballistic missile issue, they tried that as well. That was the Yankee 2 with a solid ballistic missile. And they weren't futzing with conventional weapons. They were just going to do a nuclear barrage. And they came to the conclusion that even with nuclear weapons, the accuracy of the solution and the accuracy of the missile would not help solve the problem. And therefore, the whole thing was canceled. Now, the only thing I would point out is all of this is pre-GPS.
Yeah.
Once you get satellite navigation, the uncertainty in where the missile is largely goes away. If it functions properly, it's within about 6 meters of where it thinks it is.
Yeah.
6 meters is a good number.
Yeah, and so, you know, I was actually talking with Andy the other day. His comment was that he thinks that the submarine force, he's almost sure that he remembers that the submarine force defined PNT different than the official DoD definition. PNT is defined by the DoD definition as position, navigation, and targeting. Andy remembers it the way that I did, which was precision, navigation, and targeting. Because my argument is position and navigation are the same thing, and the thing that makes PNT as a warfare area interesting is the precision of it, right? We've always had navigation. We've always had targeting. The thing that is different is the ability to say, you know, it's with things like PNT technologies is how you get to centimeter accuracy so you can pluck a descending Starship Heavy booster out of the air, right?
I'm going to take a little exception to that. Precision, okay. You're mixing precision and accuracy. Precision is the ability to replicate something with a consistent outcome.
Good point. Good point.
Accuracy is getting it right. So I think position is good because it's where you are now. Navigation is where you want to go, and targeting is the endpoint.
Okay. All right. That's actually not a bad argument. Maybe it should be ant.
I was thinking pant, but that's okay.
Maybe pant. Something like that.
Yeah. Now, mind you, you're talking to a guy who used to target Poseidon missiles, so.
Yes, and Chris has told me some stories that we're not gonna share.
No.
Mostly because they're personnel related, not because they're classified.
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution where you're telling where 40 kiloton packages of liquid sunshine are supposed to go.
Yes. So I will note that this encapsulated harpoon, for those of you who are into submarines, you'll note a length of 20 foot 6 inches and a diameter of 21 inches. That is the standard U.S. Navy 21 by 21 dimension. 21 by 21 is the dimension of a Mark 48 ADCAP torpedo also, because that's basically the biggest thing you can put in that tube.
Mm-hmm.
So the Russians experimented with 53 centimeter torpedo tubes. I'm sorry, not 53, 65.
Both. And they're humongous tubes. The
Russian 51 is 53, right?
Yeah, the Russian 21-inch tube, their torpedoes are all like almost 8 meters long.
Yeah, so the Russians built some big tubes for some bigger weapons that for a while there, it looked like the entire world was going to go to 65 centimeters, or at least the high-end powers. We toyed with it. We talked about putting 65 centimeter tubes in Seawolf, and we sort of like didn't at the last second, if I remember correctly. And so, it looked like everything was going to get bigger. But this actually sort of goes back to one of the reasons why modular weapon systems are good. And that includes things like aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are modular weapon systems. If you want to put a bigger gun on a battleship, if you haven't planned for that, that might actually be a pretty difficult evolution.
The Seawolf originally was supposed to have 24-inch tubes. That's about 61 centimeters. And I think the holes were that big, but we never developed a torpedo, so we just sleeved them to take 53s. Now, when you talk about the Russians in big, the 65-76A Wakehomer, that's 65 centimeters in diameter, it's 11 meters long. It's 36 feet long.
Wow.
Can't downsize fuel.
No, you can't downsize fuel. By the way, I made that comment to Pat, although I believe I said it as you can't miniaturize fuel, and he thought that was really good. So he liked that.
I mean, that particular torpedo had both fuel and an oxidizer, high test peroxide. So to get the range they wanted with the speed they wanted, it's got to be big. That's
which torpedo is this again?
65-76A. This is what killed Kursk.
I was just going to ask, and is that the fuel mixture that killed Kursk too? Because wasn't there two variations on that torpedo?
Well, there was a 65-73, but that was a nuclear warhead.
I thought I remembered that they had gone to something that was significantly cheaper. That it was, but
you're thinking the 53-65.
Okay.
K Wakehomer. The bigger one, the 65-76A, was high test peroxide, which has to be cared for very carefully.
Yes. You don't upset the high test peroxide.
Yes.
Not the high test peroxide.
That torpedo exceeded all intervals by almost a factor of 2 of its maintenance requirement. And then there was this little thing about the potentiality of some people reusing gasket material. And there was a leak in the high test peroxide tank. And the problem is if HTP comes in contact with a hydrocarbon, like say grease on a roller, it explodes. It's hypergolic. And it just goes foom. And then the rest of it goes foom. And then everything in the torpedo room then goes foom.
Yeah, hypergolic is, hypergolic's a feature right up until the point where it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, hypergolics are really reliable. That's why hypergolics are used. That's why the Apollo service module engine and the Apollo lunar module engines and the space shuttle orbital maneuvering system engine are all hypergolics. In fact, I don't know if you knew this, Chris, the orbital maneuvering system engines on the space shuttle are essentially Apollo engines.
Mm-hmm.
I did not realize that until actually fairly recently. So the end result is all that stuff. Hypergolics are incredibly reliable, but they have some very, very dramatic failure modes.
Yes, they can really ruin your whole day.
Yeah. So, anything else on this slide? Anything?
Nope. Just that this is an actual, very accurate diagram. It came out of a declassified document. So this is true. So let's look at, this was the big point of Chris's and my discussion. Can you make the LCS kind of like a pod knot? Well, both designs have really large stern doors, as you can see here. So there's great access to the sea. Both designs have a lot of space assigned to the module mission bays. LCS-1 has 6,500 square feet, and LCS-2 has more than twice that. That's what happens when you have a trimaran hull. It's really wonderful. Now, both mission modules, the design goal was 210 tons. But that includes fuel for any aircraft that you want to take along. So what you actually got stuck with was about 180 tons for anything that goes inside the mission bay.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that like a ship stability issue?
No, it's where they planted the tank so you can fuel your helicopters. It's all that wonderful helipad space that you like.
Right. But I mean, were they limited to 180 tons just because of like the strength of the deck?
No, I think that's their payload limit. Which
why is the limit?
Well, when you build a ship, for stability purposes, as well as where you're going to put it in terms of the hull and its center of gravity, you do get restricted on what you can carry. Now, they've got a lot of their payload relatively high. If you look at the radars, you look at the RAM missile launchers, those are about as high up as you're going to get. So you can't have a ton of weight. The helicopter hangar is fairly high up.
Yeah, and the other thing about these things is it's the Littoral Combat Ship. They're shallow draft.
Yeah.
So there's not a whole lot below the waterline there.
Yeah, and they don't have fin stabilization, so they don't like to roll around a bit. So the limit
fin stabilization, at least on LCS-1.
Yeah, the weight limits are what set this up. And part of the problem with a lot of the failures, like the ASW module, they couldn't build it and have it be light enough. It was on the LCS-1. There were reports of lowering that outer door in some sea states to ship water. So that's bad.
Yeah, I mean, I can believe that. If you were in following seas, that door is really close to the ocean.
Yep.
Following seas is when the waves are coming from behind.
We used to call it a pooping sea.
Yeah. Which reminds me, I was going to use the word poop to describe the launching of BuNine missiles. So I just poops them out. So, and I forgot. But now I forgot. Okay. Anything else on this slide?
Nope.
All right.
So this gives you an idea of really the kind of the space that you have. Unfortunately, it's not, all that space is not readily available. LCS-1 has got a really clunky design. The mission bays are in 3 separate compartments. They're all connected, but you got bulkheads in the way, which is problematic. I mean, it makes
doors between the bulkheads?
Huh?
Doors between the bulkheads?
I actually think they're just open holes. I think the bulkheads are there for structure.
Okay.
Because I haven't seen any really good photos of it. All I know is that it's broken up into 3 compartments and that there are bulkheads. But nobody said anything about watertight.
Yeah.
So I just assume that means that they're open. LCS-2 has really one big humongous compartment, but they have a bunch of support stanchions, and you can see 2 of them on the picture to the right. You can see the first 2, and they have them about every 25 feet or so. Those also break up the space, but you can probably work around those a little bit better. Now, these mission modules were all designed to have, as Chris and I were talking about, modular weapons, either uncrewed vehicles, USVs, UUVs, weapon systems, and a lot of the electronics were going to come in 20-foot equivalent units, or TEUs, which is your standard shipping container, to hold the electronics, provide the cooling, provide the electrical hookups, all that, so that you just shove them in, you hook them up, and you use them.
Yeah. Do they have an overhead crane to move that stuff around?
Yeah, a number of them have some overhead cranes, particularly because for LCS-1, storing your rib boats and other such things are off to the side.
No, I meant for moving modules around in the bay.
I don't know about that. You would. I would really have to look hard on that. I don't know if they can move them up. They come in through a side hatch. You can see it on LCS-1. They come in there, and then I don't know if they're hooked up to a overhead crane system, or if they're just put down on, a dolly or a set of dollies. They wheel it over and then they park it.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know how you move that around. So from touring Peter Gould's old Roro, they had specialized, I want to use the term forklift, except it doesn't have forks. They're container lifting things that actually grab the containers on the top, through the holes on the top, and lift them up like that and move them over, which is what you need if you're going to stack containers, right? You have to grab them from the top to put it on.
This design is one of the reasons why the swapping out of modules from remote locations proved to be so difficult, and why swap out was dropped.
Yeah, Paul N says it's called a container handler. So
okay,
that sounds good.
Okay, so, let's go to the next one.
Okay.
So LCS has got a weight problem already. And you can't put traditional launchers anywhere you want because the available weight is aft. And then above it is that thing called the helo deck. And, helicopter pilots really frown about trying to have to dodge around missile launchers. So you're really constrained as what you can put on an LCS. Particularly high volume missile launchers, way too much, and you'd have to give up your flight deck or a lot of the stuff forward. Now, An encapsulated harpoon, as I've already said, is already its own launcher. You just got to figure out a way to get it into the water. And one of the things that I ran into when I was doing some mine warfare work for a couple of people is a company called SH Defense had this TEU-based rapid mine laying system. It's all broken out into the 20-foot equivalent units. And you could turn any ship into a phenomenal mine layer as long as you have access to the sea. Well, the LCS gives us that, so that solves that problem.
Yeah.
So, next. So when you look at this thing, and you look at the amount of mines and weight, when you add up the weight, those 5 mines up there weigh about as much as a harpoon, encapsulated harpoon. So if I stretch this module, because the launcher and the 2 storage racks are just over 18 meters, to take harpoons, it would have to be 19. I'd have to stretch it just a little bit, and this would allow me to have 2 missiles in encapsulated form on the launchers, which basically just roll it into the water, and I'd have 8 more behind it that could be rapidly moved in and launched. So taking into account the weight of the launching system and 10 harpoons in a ready fire situation, you're talking 30 tons. That's nowhere near our limit.
Yeah.
Which means you could store even more harpoons if you could figure out how to get them in to the racks. That's the bigger problem, is to maneuver stored weapons, have a hydraulic system to put them into the ready racks, and then the racks themselves handle the launch. But with this approach, you could get a 10 harpoon salvo, with all missiles going off within about 2 seconds of each other. So you get really good salvo density and salvo arrangement.
Did you do the numbers with Naval Strike Missile?
No, because Naval Strike Missile, you can't get in the water. So I just said, never mind.
Well, I mean, is the Naval Strike Missile small enough that you could encapsulate it?
It would be bigger than a harpoon, and you would have to be a completely different development program.
Okay.
I'm just looking at something that's off the shelf, literally, on these things. They're both off the shelf approaches.
Well, we got a bunch of old harpoons.
There you go.
So as they can pull them,
and LCS has Link 16, so she doesn't have to find them. She just gets it from somebody else, and she says, "Never mind, I'm rolling pods."
Yeah, and like we buy a bunch of Naval Strike Missiles and fill the tubes on the Burks with the Naval Strike Missile. And we've got all these. We pull all the harpoons off the rest of the surface fleet, and we put them here. So that would work. Okay. Next slide.
Yep. So the footprint for the launcher is about 175 square feet. Again, a pittance. Same with the weight. It's only 17%.
I remember that the total square footage on LCS2 was 15,000 square feet?
Over 15. It was like 15,200 square feet. But
yeah,
again, those stanchions eat into what we can get at.
Well, and we're gonna weigh out before we cube out.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case here as well. But still, you could have in an LCS, and definitely in LCS2, you could have multiple 10 missile salvos.
Yeah.
In fact, I think LCS2 has the volume and weight allowance to allow it to carry the harpoon load of a typical battle group, which is like 4 or 5 ships.
Yeah, I can believe that. Now, when I was going to sea all the time, I'd always count harpoon launchers on the escorts, and it was not. I think the most number of harpoons I ever saw on a surface ship was 8.
Yeah. Well, Long Beach had 16.
No, but I never saw Long Beach.
You never saw it. That was the only ship that I knew of that had 16.
Well,
besides,
and the other thing is, the harpoon launchers are one of the things that the Burks lost when they got the hangar. So I don't think the Burks have I don't think the Flight 2As and I don't know about the Flight 3s. I don't think the Flight 2As actually have launchers. So harpoon, for what it's worth for everybody, harpoon is sort of the poster child for modular missile systems, in that the harpoon comes encapsulated. A harpoon launcher is basically just a metal framework that you attach this canister to, and then it's got the electronics that plugs some wires in. The harpoon panel, the computer control panel, is about the size of your laptop screen.
Yeah, it's small.
It's very small. In fact, you may recall I've got that picture that I took aboard USS Wisconsin. It's got a harpoon computer game manual on top of sitting on the harpoon launching manual. So they're small, and it's pretty much self-contained, and you just got wires that go out to the launchers.
Yeah.
And so all that's a package that fits together, that there's not a whole lot there in that regard. So I mean, I love that weapon system. People have mounted that weapon system on the back of pickup trucks. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. So LCS2 would really benefit from this. LCS1 is problematic only because moving the spare missiles moving the reloads will be more difficult. And it's probably going to be heavier. So I don't think it can be the same, but you can get, just by doing, a little map on a hull with the proper length and width, you could get 3 salvos easily out of an LCS1. You'll get more out of an LCS2. This would actually make the LCS worth having, because it does one mission well instead of all missions poorly.
Yeah, and it takes there's a tube problem in the fleet, and not having enough of them, and to some degree it's apples and oranges, because like I said, the harpoons aren't mounted in VLS. There's no reason why they couldn't have made a VLS capable harpoon. Nobody just ever spent the money to do it, in part because a harpoon installation is so dirt simple. You just bolt it on and run some wires and you're ready to rock and roll. And so there wasn't really any need to sort of tie things in, put it in VLS, et cetera. And so they never really did that. But this does mean that, if you can thicken the salvos coming from a battle group in a way that the Burks don't have to worry about, that's fantastic.
You'll need a couple of changes to the missiles. Right now, their warm-up power, to get the gyro spinning, get it to talk to the computer, all come from a tube, whether it be a torpedo tube or a Mark 141 launcher tube. So the missile will have to be modified to accept a small lithium-ion battery that will, spool up the system and keep it working while it sits in the water, because it's going to take about a couple of minutes to deploy a full 10 missile salvo. And then we need to replace the pressure sensors with a SHF encrypted data link so that the firing platform can update targeting as it's in the water if necessary, but also be able to tell the missiles to launch in a particular pattern. If you want to shoot with 1 second or 2 second delays, you just need to be able to tell it that. I don't, armchair quarterbacking here. This doesn't sound like it's that hard.
It shouldn't be.
But you never can know. These are the problems I've identified. but I don't see them as being showstoppers. So overall, I think this, turning an LCS into a pod knot is potentially feasible.
If you can take an SM-6 Bravo and put it on a damn F-18 and make that work, then you can make this work. I have no doubt whatsoever. By the way, I love the pictures of that thing where this F-18's carrying a missile that's almost as long as it is.
Yeah, it's pretty big.
It's fantastic. And the fact that they did this without telling anybody they were doing it is just great. Okay, anything else on this slide?
Nope, but that's the idea that we kind of kicked around as we were talking over those many months.
Yes, and so that's the end of his presentation. I threw a couple of slides on the end. My stuff is not nearly as well put together as his. So this is a Dutch Navy support vessel. I forget exactly what they're calling it, but it's got a crew of 8 and like 24 missiles. Now I'll note I reversed this image, so this the orientation of the missiles. I think it's just an artist's conception anyway. I don't think it's set.
No.
But what you've got in the back is you've got a couple of basically TEUs in the back that are sort of the control system, etc. You've got these missiles here. You've got a crew of 8, and they just sort of tool around. And this is their way of thickening their anti-ship capability. And that's just by having a couple of fairly small ships that just sort of tool around and are there to launch missiles. So this is kind of, a similar idea. The idea you just have a very small vessel that comes along and fires missiles.
This fits in well with the Netherlands and some of the Nordic countries, where they're looking at, when they're talking about littoral, it's in their waters.
Yes.
They're not deploying this thing, and that this is actually a mobile coastal missile battery.
Yes. Yeah. Now, it has occurred to me, how tall are those bays on LCS-1 and LCS-2?
Oh, I'd have to go. I don't think I've seen a measurement in the water. I haven't seen the draft marking, so I really couldn't tell you. I just know that LCS-1's a lot lower to the water than LCS-2.
Yeah, the headroom inside those are not enough to put in vertical launch tubes, are they?
No, but if you did,
without sticking them up through the deck,
and they're too heavy.
Yeah,
you would eat out your 180 tons in no time.
I love that comment.
I'm not even sure it's a frigate.
No, it's definitely not a frigate, because a frigate,
it's a patrol boat.
Yeah, the definition of a frigate is a multi-mission vessel with just enough capability to be crappy at all mission areas.
And a couple of thousand tons too.
Yeah, and so the real big difference between frigates and corvettes, if you want to think about that, is frigates always at least pretend to be multi-mission. Yeah, at least in U.S. usage, frigates always kind of pretend to be multi-mission. Even if they're an air defense frigate, they usually have some sort of surface capability, or they have some sort of ASW capability, etc. Whereas you get much smaller in that, and they're very specialized.
Yeah, the problem is frigates are getting big.
Well, everything's getting big. Everything's getting big. Things just get bigger over time, and they get more capable. But my response was, when everybody says, a Burke is like 3 times as capable as a Spruance, it can do everything 3 times as well, so it's equal to 3 Spruances. What my response to that is, great, let's send it to 3 different locations simultaneously. Can't do that, can you?
Nope.
So this is the Dutch Navy support vessel. It's also worth bringing up Sea Hunter. So this is a DARPA product called ACTIVE, which stood for Active Continuous Trail Undersea Vessel.
Mm-hmm.
USW vessel, something like that. The idea is that this thing carries an active sonar, and it tools around looking for submarines. And once it finds it, you say, "Go get him, boy." And it just sort of follows the submarine and bing, ping, 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 and makes the submarine's life hell.
Well,
in theory,
that was the theory. When Sea Hunter first came out, it was a very big deal. And then the next Sea, Air, and Space Symposium, I think, was 2009. Or was it 2009 or 2010? And I'm talking to one of the guys who says, yeah, it doesn't have enough power to drive an active sonar.
Really? I hadn't heard that. How can you get that wrong? How can you possibly get that wrong? Okay, so
because what they were focusing on, what everybody was focusing on first, was the uncrewed capability, autonomous capability, autonomous navigation.
It's autonomous continuous trail. Yeah.
So that's what everybody was looking at. The function couldn't be supported. Now, I don't know what frequency they were using. I suspect it was high, because even an SQS-56 is going to be freaking heavy for this thing.
So the SQS-56 is the Helen Keller sonar, is what they called it, on the FIG 7, which I know at least one sailor who spent a lot of time on FIG 7s who actually said, you can. It was called the Helen Keller sonar because it was fairly short range. But his comment was the display was crystal clear. He said, "I love that sonar because you never had any doubt when you had a contact, you had a contact.
Mm-hmm.
Never had any doubt about it." He tells a story one time about being at sea, and they all of a sudden the picture got really, really weird. Like it's like they're trailing this Russian submarine. The submarine's over here, and now it's over here, and now it's over here, and now it's over here. And finally, the CO looked at him and said, "There are two submarines." And it turns out that apparently NATO Mediterranean headquarters, or Sixth Fleet headquarters, or whoever it was, I think it had to be in something NATO because I think it was a Brit. Whoever it was didn't think that this little FIG 7 was going to be able to keep up with this Russian boat, and they trailed it for like 6 days. Just kept bang, 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 bang between the Helen Keller sonar and flying helos on it. I bring this up because one of the things. So okay, let's just stipulate for purposes of this conversation that maybe they build something that looks a lot like Sea Hunter. And they actually put enough power into it that you can power an active sonar, right? You decide you're going to do it. And let's stipulate for a second that the incongruity of every time they try to minimally man something, it turns out that they're wrong. But when I take the manning from like 50 to 0, somehow magic is going to happen, and now minimal manning is going to work, right? How much more minimal can you get than 0? Aside from all that, how do you support these things if you've got them out with you? And it occurs to me that one way you support these things is through a platform that has a big mission bay in which you can put all the gear you need to support these things and the extra fuel tanks you need to refuel them, et cetera, et cetera. And you use a ship you've already got that's got this big mission bay to do that. Now, you have now heard all of the analytical effort I have put into that idea. So I have not written down any numbers. I've done no research, et cetera, et cetera. This was just an idea. I hadn't even slept in a Holiday Inn. But it was kind of the idea that I came up with. So who knows? I mean, Sea Hunter was sort of an interesting idea. I don't know that it's ever shown up in a novel.
Well, it's a surface ship, so it never crossed our threshold.
I mean, it's one of its big virtues is that it's not worth wasting a Mark 48 on, or the equivalent.
Well, that's true.
But I think that's the last slide. So Paul N says, drive it right up inside the amphib deck of an LHD like the Wasp class. Well, funny you mention that. When we get to Mike Bosworth's stuff, he actually talks about you can have something like an LPD or an LHD that carries LCACs, but it could conceivably carry something other than LCACs. And so he wrote all this stuff back in basically the early to mid 90s. And so at that time period, we're not talking about LCS and we're not talking about unmanned systems, but we were potentially talking about, things that look like patrol hydrofoils and stuff like that. So we're actually going to get into some of those discussions going forward. So, and I think I'm going to start that on the next show that I end up doing, which is probably going to be next weekend. But who knows? As I said, I'm going to go in and have some medical stuff done, and it depends on what my doctor tells me. If I end up having to go in and do stuff sooner rather than later, we'll see. Let's see. Let me go back through the questions real quick. Scrolling up to the beginning. So this is the sort of stuff that StreamYard dumps into the stream.
Alas.
Yes. Let's see. Scrolling down. So my brother Delon is here. Bob Orr's here. Hello, Bob. How are you? Played a lot of Space Hulk with Bob back in the day. Paul N points out Podnot's trick is simultaneous launch of hundreds, if not thousands, of missiles each. So you could fire an entire Weber of missiles.
Yeah, of course, it's worth noting that a Podnot is just shy of 8 million tons.
Yeah, Weber ships are big.
It's huge.
Yeah. And he only talks in terms of tons. Early on, he started talking in terms of he gave some dimensions for some of the ships. And the problem is that he hadn't really sort of calculated what the density was. And the density, as Ken Burnside puts it, the density of some of these ships was the density of cigar smoke. Yeah. Now, it's interesting. Ken talked him into something called the Great Resizing, which is basically it boiled down to ignore all the sizes, just pay attention to the displacements, to the mass. It's actually mass, not displacement. The problem with that is Andy Presby then came along and pointed out that Whipple armor is a thing. And so Whipple armor is based upon the idea that you have big empty voids inside. And so you have multiple layers of armor with a void inside. So something comes through the first layer, it sprays in all directions rather than going as, a solid slug or, going specifically through. When it sprays in all directions and it spreads out the damage on the second layer of armor or the third or the fourth and doesn't penetrate there. And so that's sort of how, to the degree that you armor satellites, that's kind of how you do it. You have multiple layers with gaps in between. And so it's unclear as to what would have happened in terms of the Great Resizing if BuNine had been part of that discussion back then, but BuNine didn't exist at that point. Paul points out that you can view the BuNine as being an arsenal ship. And so arsenal ship was an idea from the early 2000s or late 90s. And the idea was that you took something that was like the size of a for a Navy ship, a very large ship but like, maybe a good sized freighter, except it was going to be low in the water to make it less observable. And you'd just put like 200 tubes on it. And it would just, have 200 tubes and it could flatten whatever. And it was really sort of intended as a strike asset hitting stuff ashore, not really against other ships.
I would kind of disagree with Paul's association here, because a podnot is heavily armed with energy weapons, counter missile launchers, point defense laser clusters. It's a true, honest to God combatant.
I
the
think
arsenal ship was just a missile, carrier.
It's a missile barge.
Yeah.
It was a seagoing missile field.
Now, when that was a big deal, when the arsenal ship was a big deal, the number of studies that was done on how this ship should look was impressive. I've got several detailed naval architect level studies on this thing. And it all comes down to big, slow, vulnerable, and expensive.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, you put 200 tubes. Think about what the cost of payload's going to be. One of the other things about arsenal ship is that the Navy experimented with a sort of a different procurement model than what they usually use. And as a result, it never really had a constituency behind it. And as a result, it did not survive particularly well. But one of the really cool things about it is that the arsenal ship was sort of the Navy's equivalent of the lightweight fighter program that turned into the F-16, right? So usually when DoD puts out a request for proposals on a new weapons platform, a major weapons platform, the document is 200 pages thick and specifies everything. The RFP for the F-16, for what turned into the F-16, 4 pages. This is what we're trying to accomplish. This is kind of how we think it should work. This is kind of what we're willing to pay. Come up with something.
And the Navy took the loser.
Yeah. I mean, this was such a successful model. It was so successful that 2 things happened. One is that the loser also got made. And the second thing was they never did it again. Except the Navy kind of did it with arsenal ship. They had a very, very short, not quite 4 pages, but I want to say it was like on the order of like 10, if I remember correctly. There's a case study about this that I remember reading. It was very short, and basically they did the same thing, and they said, we want something that shoots a lot of missiles and is going to be kind of stealthy, which is mainly just low in the water. Like the USS Monitor. What could go wrong? And so, that's what we're looking for. Come up with something. Well, part of the problem is because it didn't go through the normal process. It didn't have a constituency fighting for it, and so when it at some point it just got cut, and everybody went, all right, I guess we're done, and moved on without fighting for it. Okay. Sucks to be the Solarian Leaguers. Yes, it does.
It does.
Wright points out the 10% Truth podcast did an excellent interview with a USMC who flew Hornets and then went to Tyndall and flew F-22s. And then was one of the skipper of the first USMC squadrons. That I got to look that up. That sounds pretty interesting. So Wright was going to go host Rocky Horror Picture Show, so he's probably gone by now. So have fun doing that. He's got a part-time job at a local theater that it's basically he just really likes the theater, and he likes being on the staff so that he can occasionally do things like, hey, I'd like to rent the theater for my birthday party. Paul correctly figured out that we were talking about Kursk before we actually said Kursk. Scrolling. Olive, I'm sorry to hear you threw out your back. Hope you're feeling better. Okay. Delon asks, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? European or African, Delon?
What has this got to do with the price of tea in China?
Yeah, and Bob points out that we're supposed to both be on a panel at PhilCon, and so I'm looking forward to seeing Bob. I haven't seen Bob in a long time. I certainly haven't seen Bob since he retired. So I saw on Facebook that he finally pulled the handles and left the aircraft. So, and I guess Paul commented, I guess my guesses are pretty good for an Army guy. Yes, they are. So, okay, I think we don't have anything else. Do you have anything else, Chris?
No, sir.
All right. So, as always, I would like to thank everybody for coming and spending their Saturday night with me. And, I'd like to thank Chris for coming and spending his Saturday night with all of us. As always, this was really good. I'm thinking it's probably going to be Mike Bosworth the next time. I will find out probably on Wednesday whether I'm doing a show on Saturday. I think I'm doing a show on Saturday. I'm almost positive I'm doing a show on Saturday. But I do know that one of the medical tests that they were talking about doing involves basically the same sort of preparation that you have to do for a colonoscopy, and I have no idea when that's going to start. So I may not be in the mood to do something like that. We'll figure that out. And so with that, so I'll let you know when I know what we're going to do. Let's see. Hold on a second. One last one. Logic's Finest says, he said, was my question not taken seriously? I missed it. And that question is, will we ever see return to ships fighting each other with big guns, or is that ship sailed?
I think that ship has sailed.
So here's the scenario where that ship might not have sailed, right? It is not the scenario that I think is most likely, but here's, I think, what you'd have to have happen for that. And even then, there's issues. If you find yourself in a situation where you were able to get extremely long range from a gun, the cost ratio at a relatively low cost per round, it might make something like that work again, right? The rail gun was the sort of thing that, might be able to make that happen. There were lots of people that said, every now and then you get people saying like, maybe we could build battleships again. Wouldn't that be cool if we could build battleships again with rail guns? And there, some of those people weren't me. But the thing is that we never quite made that work. I really wondered so at one point they took the high velocity projectile idea from the rail gun, which is a very slim projectile that did a lot of its damage through kinetics. And because it was so slim, you could shoot at long distances. And they basically said, look, we can get like 80% of the capability of a railgun with just a regular powder gun if we change our ammo. And so and railguns are hard, and we're having a hard time making it work. So let's just buy new ammo. Well, that kind of went by the wayside too. And I think if I remember correctly, most of the reason why that went by the wayside is they kind of concluded that they really did want it to go boom when it hit.
Exactly.
And that they couldn't make it much smaller than it was. And so people are looking at ways to make guns more effective because in terms of shot per, cost per round, even an expensive round is cheaper than a missile as a general rule. But nobody's quite been able to make it work.
Well, like I said, AGS doesn't agree with you. The advanced gun system, the individual rounds were approaching,
but still cheaper.
Yeah, by that much.
Well, yeah, but part of the thing with AGS is that they were never talking about guns get cheaper. Gun rounds get cheaper because you crank them out like sausages, right? The thing about missiles is that they don't get that much cheaper when you crank them out like sausages, but gun rounds can. Especially if all the gun rounds don't have to be fancy. But one of the problems they ran into with gun rounds is, the people talked about, you can make GPS chips really cheap. And they also talked, so we can have guided rounds. And they also talked about, you can make GPS chips that can survive 10,000 Gs. So you can fire them out of a gun. You can't do both at the same time. So that really turned out to be the problem, is that they never, for things like that, they were never able to make we're only going to spend a quarter on this chip and it's going to take 10,000.
Besides, one of the other problems with the high velocity guns, the rounds there, barrel wear.
Yeah. Yeah.
They ate through the gun barrels so quickly.
It's yet another data point for my hypothesis that in the end, all problems are material science problems.
And even if you know where the shell knows where it's going, the longest range engagement was what? In World War II, 28,000, 30,000 yards. Whether or not you count Yamato's hit on Gambier Bay, did that really happen or not? You're still at that range, you're looking at a 2% probability of hit.
Yeah.
And you want to go further?
Well, this is one of those situations. This is why when push comes to shove, I'm a science fiction fan, is because you can take good ideas like this and say, all right, let's just go ahead and make it work. Like in the back of my head, there's a novel I want to write where it's my version of Ghost Fleet, which there was a time period where I told everybody, if you haven't read Ghost Fleet, I told all the people I worked with, if you haven't read Ghost Fleet, you need to read Ghost Fleet. And the reason why you needed to read Ghost Fleet is that everybody in the Pentagon has read Ghost Fleet, and it's affecting their thinking.
Adversely.
Yeah, and you should read it too. But the thing about Ghost Fleet is that they in that universe they managed to get the railgun working, and they had put it on the fleet. Basically gets Battlestar Galactica at the beginning of the war. The Cylons come and kill, or in this case the Chinese kill them at the beginning of the war, and so they had to pull everything out of the reserve fleet. And one of the things they pulled out of the reserve fleet with the Zumwalts, and they were able to put a railgun on. And so you could shoot like 80 nautical miles with it, and it was cool, or 200 nautical miles or whatever. And that made me thinking, like, okay, what if I could put a rail gun in a Iowa turret? What if I could put a capacitor, take out the middle barrel, put capacitors in there, and basically run rail guns in the other two holes?
You don't need to take out the third gun. You've been in.
Yeah.
That's a real deep barbette. You've got plenty of room. And once you take out the powder, because you're not using that. You got plenty of space for capacitors. What it gets down to is how do you charge them?
Yes. Yeah. Well, you charge them with the molten salt nuclear reactor that you install.
Yeah.
Science fiction. This is all science fiction.
And just out of curiosity, are you going to put an explosive in these things? Because if you hit a ship with a, basically for all intents and purposes, a armor-piercing round with no explosive, you know what you get? 2 small portholes in the target.
Well, we'd probably have to have something like that. Probably have to have something like that.
Yeah.
So I'd love to write that story. It's on the list, but it's not at the top of the list. It's not even close to the top of the list. But I do like the idea of potentially replacing all the boilers and stuff like that with a molten salt reactor. And one of the things, I've talked about this on the show before, in fact, maybe we've talked about this on the show before. People think of the turret of a battleship as being that structure that's on the deck that rotates. That is the penthouse of the turret. The turret.
The business end.
I'm sorry, what?
The business end.
The business end, but it's the top end of a rotating structure that goes down like 5 decks.
Yeah, and it's not small.
No, it's not. It's basically, there's a small building that fits into a hole, and the entire building rotates. And so that's where you'd probably end up putting all the capacitors. You don't actually need to put it in the turret up front. You put all that stuff.
They got plenty of space down below.
Yeah, and so you've got plenty of space and stuff like that. And this is one of the things. I love Jerry Purnell's work, but Jerry Purnell clearly didn't understand that when he designed Michael from Footfall. He didn't, because I haven't sat down and sort of figured out if the novel has enough to figure out. But I think that he's got a 16-inch gun turret from a Iowa class battleship on either side. I think that that there isn't enough space to have the entire turret there. I'll have to have all the ammo handling stuff, let alone the question about whether you can make all that stuff work in 0G. I think that ship goes up with a total of 6 rounds. They're all in the barrel, and that's it, as a practical matter. So, yeah, Paul N points out that a pebble bed reactor would be safer, but it's not as cool as molten salt.
Pebble bed reactors are humongous because your active zone is huge.
So Tom May, in his book A Sword into Darkness, used pebble bed reactors for the Space Force ships. In fact, I've told people, and I'm pretty sure I've told you this, that there's 2 books that I almost always read in unison. The second one is Tom May's A Sword into Darkness. The first one is Lash Up. And that's because both of these books involve the President of the United States clandestinely creating a space force. The difference between the two, in Chris's book, they load up Venture Star to send it up into orbit to do what it needs to do. In Tom May's book, the premise is that an internet billionaire understands that the weird astronomical thing that everybody's witnessing is actually a decelerating starship, but he can't get DOD or NASA to pay attention to this idea. So he finally says, screw it, I'm an internet billionaire, I'll build the Space Force. And so he then proceeds to spend the next 35, 40 years developing all the technologies and actually building a small fleet of space-going warships, a space-going destroyer, powered by a pebble bed reactor.
Yeah, that's because pebble beds make really good gas-cooled reactors.
Yeah, and I think in this particular case, it had to do with what technology they were able to get their hands on. Like at one point, they the people that were doing it, when finally the government came around to, after only 39 years or something like that, they said, oh, maybe it is actually aliens. The government finally came around. They said to the guys who were building the stuff, said, hey, could we get some fissionable materials to like maybe do some nuclear weapons? And they said, well, hell no. They wouldn't let the civilians have the nuclear weapons. So the civilians figured out a way to MacGyver them together without a primary.
Okay.
And it all came to do with how the drive worked. Basically, Tom reinvented the thruster plate from Traveler. It gave off monochromatic blue light, so they called it the Kmart drive because of the blue light special. And so they were able to figure out that this thing puts out a tremendous amount of force, and the way that you could make fusion weapons is to have a sphere that was covered with basically on the inside with this thing shining towards the middle. And they were able to get enough force to actually squeeze some hydrogen and make it go boom. So, okay, so let's see. Coming back, there's more questions now. Let me go through them real quick. Discussion on railguns. Yep. How far away are we from energy weapons and phasers like in Star Trek? Phasers were a long, long way. Lasers are kind of here, but they're not as useful as we thought they were going to be. There was actually an interesting article. If you do a search for this, I just saw it today, that talked about how lasers have issues with targeting and energy density and just slew rate, like keeping them on target. Actually,
the dwell time is what's doing it. We're not getting it's not one burst is a kill. That's the problem. We have to dwell to deposit the energy, and that means you have to really stay tight on a target, and that's hard. Now, lasers are great in the anti-drone world.
Yeah, in the anti-drone world, they're great. And if you think about it, the issues with lasers are power and dwell time, slew rate, things like that. And so power, you have a problem if you want to put it on an aircraft, or you have a problem if you want to put it on a land vehicle. So, okay, fixed installations is really kind of where you want, because you can plug it into the grid. But then, like if you're defending an airbase or something like that, they're all over the place, right? And so you've got issues with missiles. Where do you put it? And you're having to pivot the thing, et cetera, because it's not coming directly at the laser. So what did I just describe as being the perfect platform to put a laser on?
A ship.
A ship. Because you got a big ass generator there, and you also have, it's the target, so the missile's coming at you, which means you can hit the seeker with it, and it's a two-dimensional problem as a general rule if you're using it for self-defense. So it makes a lot more, in my mind, it makes a lot more sense on a ship. And you'll notice that the US Navy is building ships with a lot of excess power generation capability. Like,
it depends. If you're talking about the Berk 3s, they're building just enough.
Yeah,
they've got to. Did you look at the cooling requirements for that radar?
They need to build more. I know that there's
no space to put anything else in. She's topped out.
Add 10 feet.
Okay. Well,
add another 20 feet, call it the Berk class cruiser, and be done with it.
Yeah, I'd like to see that, but
add 20 feet. Add 20 feet, name it after Willis Lee.
I'm not too sure that would be a good, wouldn't hurt, but I think he might object to having, only a 20 millimeter gun as his primary.
Willis Lee was a practical guy. If he had missiles, he would have been a missile guy.
That's true.
He's my favorite admiral, and we're going to talk about him on the show at some point. I need to read the bio.
Mine's Spruance.
Spruance is pretty damn good too. Spruance is pretty damn good, and I've got a soft spot for Halsey too.
I have to have enough pre-reading lubrication before I can really handle Halsey.
We should talk about Halsey at some point. So Logic's Finest asks, any definitive answer about why Ford carriers don't have operational energy weapons? Not yet. Give them time. Not yet. They built in excess power capacity specifically so they could put
right, but they had to get the electromagnetic catapult working.
Yeah.
And the electromagnetic arresting gear working.
So their default assumption is that ship is going to be in the fleet for 50 years.
Yeah.
And so you build in a lot of excess capacity, and, you know, it goes back to like what I was talking about with Tomahawk anti-ship missile, right? You've got parallel developments, and not everything gets ready at the same time. And in this particular case, you know, you go ahead and you deploy the ship, and then as new weapons come on, you put the new weapons on. And so my guess is at some point they'll have lasers. If nothing else, they'll have lasers for anti-drone stuff. But my guess is they'll have lasers for missile defense. So Delon says, amount of energy to have an effective phaser is much more than what the current technology would seem practical. Part of the issue is that what we see for phasers, the phaser explanation has a lot of technobabble about the rapid Nadion effect. And if anybody can tell me what the rapid Nadion effect is, I'll build you a phaser with it. But as far as I can tell, it's just pure made up technobabble.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Scrolling. Paul points out John Ringo's Troy Rising series is good space opera. Yes, it is. Navy fielded a laser. They did a test. I don't know that ship still has it. Air Force tried a 747 size laser.
The ABL. Oh God, that was a disaster.
My boss's boss at one point said something that led me to believe that he was the guy who killed it. And the problem with ABL, I actually wrote a paper in grad school on the ABL. Whether it could be used as an anti-satellite weapon. The problem with ABL is the laser turned out to be a lot heavier than they thought. The lasing modules turned out to be heavier than they thought. So they ended up with fewer modules on board the airplane, and that gave them lower power than they expected. And the thing was incredibly, like, it's dumping out fluorine.
Yep.
As the reaction exhaust from it. So it's like, yeah, this is bad shit. And really, it was only had like one use case, which is tooling around outside of North Korea and poking holes in North Korean missiles on their way up. Everything else about it, it wasn't, it was very particular about where you needed to put it and what it could see and all the rest of it. Even if you sort of press the I believe button on it, and I think in the end, the engineering did not justify pressing the I believe button on it.
There was an Air Force major who came to the predecessor to our shop. He came from ABL, and he had horror stories.
Yeah, I can believe it.
A lot of them were plumbing horror stories.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is a lot of their horror stories sort of fit in the same category as the ME-163. So the ME-163 high test peroxide had an issue with, like at one point it had a sort of a what would in any other aircraft have been a minor crash landing. And the fuel tank behind the pilot broke, and it dissolved the pilot.
Yes.
dissolve the pilot. So, so Paul says, isn't the Ford class the first one designed replacing the reactor and returning to service? I think the plan on the Ford is the Ford class.
Ford class is life of core.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Life of ship core.
Yeah, so the idea is that you never have to refuel it.
Yeah, you don't replace the reactor. You never replace the reactor. You replace the core.
Yeah, and so, but in this case, the plan is not even to replace the core. The plan is just put enough fuel in that it's still got some oomph left at the end. So,
which means what that really means is that the Navy will be very careful in managing its deployments to make sure that the core lasts for the service life of the platform.
Yeah. You know, they always keep a running, contrary to the conventional wisdom, there is a fuel tank gauge on nuclear reactors. It's just calibrated in different units than what the guys who have gas turbines use. And so you monitor how much of the core you've used. And so this is the reason why you don't tool around going every place at, 90 knots or whatever, right?
Yeah, the reactor operator, one of his log entries is for over a period of time is effective full power hours used.
Yeah. Which basically translates as, Captain, could we go slower, please? So I'm surprised I haven't done more coughing because I'm still coughing. Okay, so that brings us to the end. And so this time we really are going to call it.
And please.
Yeah, because we're at the hour and 47 mark.
Yeah.
So as usual, the hour-long show goes almost 2 hours.
Yeah.
But as I said previously, thank you very much to Chris for coming on to the show. Thank you everybody for spending your Saturday night here with us. I really appreciate it. I'll figure out exactly what we're going to do next week, and then we'll do it. And I'll let you know as soon as I know. But in the meantime, everybody have a good weekend. See you later.
Yep. Take care.